You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode about a Green Beret who spent nearly 30 years in uniform in every major engagement from Vietnam to Black Hawk Down and is now part of one of the most notable veterans companies called GORUCK. We'll get to that coming up in a few minutes. But a few reminders before we get started. Please continue to keep the Apple Podcast reviews coming. We want to crack the top 100 Apple Podcasts, and we can't do it without you, so it's really simple. Go to our podcast on Apple and leave a review. Doesn't have to be a lengthy one or a long one. Just click 5 stars on the rating, leave a short review. If you're on your cell phone right now, you can just scroll down to the bottom of where our podcast is. You'll see a rating and a review button. Click them, give us the rating, write a short review, and you're good to go. We want to crack that top 100 podcast, so we can't do it without you. We love the reviews. We try to share them all on social media as much as we can, so certainly keep them coming. Speaking of social media, make sure you follow us on all those sites as well, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also check out our website, hazardground.com, because that's where our Amazon promotion is. If you go to the website, hazardground.com, click on the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage or under the sponsors tab, it'll redirect you right to Amazon. You can do all of your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we'll donate a percentage of that back to some of the great charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. This also works on your smartphone. So if you go to a web browser on your smartphone, put in hazardground.com, click on the Amazon button, it'll take you right to the Amazon app, so you don't have to reload your credit card information. Really simple, really easy, and certainly a great way to help out veterans doing your normal Amazon shopping. If you have any guest suggestions or just want to drop us a note, send an email to producer@hazardground.com. We read all of them. We take our time and want to respond to all of them. So for whatever reason, if you've sent us an email and haven't gotten a response, please do it again, producer@hazardground.com. We love hearing from you guys, and we certainly love that you guys are a big part of this community and what makes this podcast and this show so special for so many people. We hope you continue to stay healthy and continue to stay safe, and thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground community. Now on to this week's episode. Joining us this week on the Hazard Ground is a retired Army Sergeant Major who's also a Green Beret who spent nearly 30 years in the Army, all of it inside of Special Operations, and fought in nearly every major conflict from multiple tours in Vietnam all the way through Somalia and Black Hawk Down, including other operations like Eagle Claw in Iran, Grenada, as well as Just Cause in Panama and the First Gulf War. He is also the senior advisor to GORUCK and GORUCK Tactical. He is Richard Rice joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Richard, welcome, and thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure.
All right, a very lengthy and extensive career, to say the least, highlighted by tons of things that, nowadays have become sort of common names and common places. While you were going through them, a lot of the world didn't know that they were going on. I mean, obviously Vietnam, but when you talk about some of the other, engagements that you were involved in throughout your career, I think the audience is really going to find that we haven't had somebody of your stature as far as the things that they have been through all in one career, right? We've talked to people who have been to Vietnam. We've talked to people who have been in Grenada, been in Panama, but it's rare that you get everybody who's been through all of those things as you did in your 25 plus years in. So certainly excited to talk to you. But just start back at the beginning for me. How and why'd you get in the Army, and how'd you end up in Special Forces?
Well, it was kind of I kind of walked into it backwards, to be honest. I have to give credit to my parents and grandparents, who were people that had lived through the 20s and 30s in America, some very harsh times, and had learned to come to depend on each other tremendously. And from that, without them actually putting it into words, I learned how important it was to work as a team. No matter where you are, you have to work as a team, because you'll go much farther as a team than you will as an individual. And so the hard times that they went through, that they passed on to me through what I didn't realize at the time, but now I realize was a mentoring program, an educational program, got me started. And of course, as I came of age, the time was for Vietnam. And America was very divided at that time. but I felt a real seriousness to serve my country. I had grown up with uncles and cousins and friends of the family and my own father who had served in World War II. And I looked up to those people as someone who had been living a life and then set it aside and served their nation and then went back to living their lives. And that was just a really important thing to me, because when I first started in the Army, I had no idea that it was going to become a career per se. And I was working for Pacific Northwest Bell Telephone Company. I graduated from high school and I had a job, and it just seemed like there was something out there that I owed to America. And the other thing was, I was pretty much on the verge, as best I could tell, of getting drafted. And I thought, gee, it makes a whole lot more sense to join and pick what I want to do than allow myself to be drafted and let somebody else, some bean counter or paper pusher somewhere, decide where they thought I should be. So I went to the Air Force recruiters, and they were full. They had everybody they needed. I went to the Navy even, because that's where my dad had served, and they were full. And the next guy I came to was the Army, and he was a pretty clever guy, I've got to admit. I sat down with him, and he said, well, what do you like to do? And I said, well, I was living in Portland, Oregon at the time. I said, I like to camp. I like to fish. I like the outdoors. I like to do things. He said, well, what's the latest thing you've done? And I said, well, I work, of course. And then when I go home, I hang out with friends. I do the normal things that a young guy does at that time. And I said, I don't know why I mentioned it, but I said, I just finished a bunch of books. And he said, really? On what? And I said, they were written by Ian Fleming. And it was the James Bond series of books. Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, have I got a deal for you? He said, I've got something that you're going to love. And I said, okay. Again, I was kind of in a trusting position.
Weren't we all when we talked to a recruiter for the first time, right?
Yeah, exactly. And he said, there's such a thing as the ASA, the Army Security Agency. And I was like, oh. And he said, and I began envisioning me in a foggy Berlin, in a fedora hat and an overcoat, smoking a cigarette, making contact with Russian agents or something. It's like, oh, okay, this is cool. And he said, oh yeah, we can hook you up with that. So I signed on the dotted line. The only being was, instead of a 3-year commitment, it was a 4-year commitment. He said, that's the only difference. If you're going to go to this special organization, you're going to have to give us 4 years. I said, huh, okay, I can probably do that. Well, I signed on the dotted line. They sent me to Fort Ord, California for basic training. And when I got there, the ASA guy showed up and said, hey, we got a deal for you. You got to choose between 2 jobs. And I thought, okay, I could be an agent or an agent handler. What do I want to do? They said, here's the jobs: high-speed radio intercept or teletype repair. And I was like, no, wait. There's some confusion here. There's no confusion. For the good of the Army, that's the 2 options that are open to you. And I was like, oh no. So I said, think it over overnight. We'll come back tomorrow. Well, the first formation the next morning in basic training was the airborne recruiter. He was looking for bodies. And of course, the first thing he said was, I really don't want to be here talking to you guys, but the Army says I have to. He said, none of you are good enough to be what I am. Oops, there goes the hook. And he said it in me really hard. So I went in to talk to him. He said, anybody that wants to could come into the orderly room and talk to me. So I went in and talked to him and explained to him my situation. He said, well, I can't get you out of the 4 years, but I can sure get you out of the ASA because we have a higher priority than them. And so I signed on the dotted line again and ended up in the 82nd Airborne Division. Now, the ASA was very upset about that. I didn't realize at the time that they had already begun processing a security clearance on me, and that went against their budget, not against the 82nd Airborne budget.
Sure.
So they were very upset about that.
So the telephone intercept operator didn't seem to interest you, because that seems very James Bondish. Well,
but as I understood it, and I don't know exactly because I never was one, but sitting in the back of a van with cans or headphones on my ears all day did not seem like the place I wanted to be. I wanted to be out where I was doing something. And so the 82nd Airborne appealed to me. So I was like, okay, I'll go for that.
Was there any thought at this point in time, just naturally going, well, Vietnam's starting, I'd be safer with a set of headphones on listening to a radio all day long than wading through the jungles as an infantryman?
Not really. I mean, I'm not sure that I had thought that far ahead, but it seemed to me that the guys with the highest esprit de corps, the people that were trained the best, in my knowledge at that time, was the 82nd Airborne Division. Mm-hmm. So if I've got to go to war, and I figured I needed to go to war, that was just the name of the game at that time. If I was going to go to war, then I wanted to go to war with the best there was.
Makes sense.
And that just seemed like the 82nd. Now, when I got to Fort Bragg and in the 82nd, I revamped that opinion.
Why is that?
Well, there's some great guys in the 82nd, and I learned a lot from some of them. But as just down the street from me at Fort Bragg was Special Forces.
Sure, that was my next question, by the way. How'd you end up there?
Yeah, and they were, as best I could tell at that point, without a whole lot of knowledge, they were the absolute best. They were the elite of the elite. And I thought, that seems like the place to go. But I wasn't eligible at that point in time. But shortly thereafter, the rules in the Army changed, and they started accepting younger or less ranking people into Special Forces, to the Special Forces training group at that time. And that's when me and a good friend of mine decided that, we wanted to go to Vietnam. We wanted that challenge. We were looking for that challenge. But we figured we wanted to go with whatever the best was, and that seemed to be Special Forces. So we volunteered and were accepted for Special Forces training.
Looking back, does that seem like naivete at this point? Or with a little bit of hindsight, like, hey, we want to go to Vietnam. I mean, that's not something a lot of people. We've talked to plenty of people on the show who took the route you did. Said, well, I'd rather have some control, so I'm going to enlist, at least to try to be able to get some measure of deciding what I'm going to do, as opposed to being told by getting drafted. But did it seem like some naivete a little bit, saying we wanted to go to Vietnam?
Two schools of thought on that. One was, again, I look back on all of the people I knew. I remember one particular family friend had participated in the Normandy invasion. Others had participated in campaigns in the Pacific. And while they didn't talk a lot about it, what they did talk about really kind of inspired me, I guess, is the best way to put it, to challenge myself, to reach deep down inside and see what I was really made of. And so there was a bit of naivete, I think. But at the same time, there was that young man with a challenge in front of him that really wanted to do something. And so many people that I admired had done things along those lines that it was now my turn to do that.
All right, so you head up to Special Forces training, and now, I mean, it can take up to, in the active duty route, it could take up to, 2.5 years by the time you begin your assessment and selection all the way through the end of the Q course. What was it like back in 1968?
Yeah, it was much shorter, because the friend and I, when we volunteered for Special Forces, we reported to Special Forces Training Group in June of 1968, just as John Wayne's movie, The Green Berets, was hitting theaters. So the night we reported in, or the night before we reported in, we went downtown Fayetteville and went to the movie. And it was kind of an eye-opening in a sense, and yet it was supportive in a sense, because it was like, wow, Are we really going to do that? And, well, they take some, Hollywood always takes a little artistic license with things. So it's probably not exactly like that. They did some of this to kind of dramatize. And so we reported into Special Forces Training Group. Training Group at that time, because of the numbers of people that were going through and the requirements of Vietnam, because they were losing a lot of people in Vietnam, they shortened, or the course was shorter, much shorter then than it is now. I went through, and I was already trained in AIT, or Advanced Individual Training, as an 05 Bravo, which was a radio operator. So I did have cans on my ears in a sense, but that was the standard Army course, not the ASA course. So when I got to Special Forces Training Group, they said, well, if you make it through phase 1, which is now we know it as a selection and assessment, if you make it through phase 1 and you go into phase 2, if you know how to copy code, then we can put you through an abbreviated course and send you to an additional cross-training course, because the idea at that time was to get as many people as possible cross-trained in more than one occupational specialty. And so I went through the selection and assessment at that time, training group for phase 1, and reported to phase 2. They set me down, and I think I copied 20 or 22 words a minute, copy and receive, or send and receive. And so they said, okay, we're going to send you to O&I school, which is Operations and Intelligence School. Mm-hmm. So I went through that with a group of 36 guys, and then went through the phase 3 and the Robin Sage, the ending exercise, the culmination exercise, and finished up in April of 69. So just about a year's length, roughly,
right,
of training, as opposed to now, I think it's like two plus years. The one that actually took longer then and still does now is the medical course, but I wasn't involved in that at all.
So after you graduate, how quickly do you end up in Vietnam?
I graduated with those 36 guys out of O&I. We all went to phase 3 together, which was the culminating exercise. And then at the end of that, we had 30 days leave, and then we were off to Vietnam, every one of us. And we shipped out of Tacoma International Airport, whatever, SeaTac, and reported into Okinawa to Vietnam 30 days later.
And where in Vietnam were you?
It was a quick pipeline. Mm-hmm. Well, we arrived at Cam Ranh Bay, and then were transferred immediately to the 5th Group headquarters, 5th Special Forces Group headquarters in Nha Trang. And we reported late one night. The next morning, they came in and they said, hey, we have a requirement for some very highly classified organizations. So if any of you guys want to do that, you're free to volunteer at this point in time. Otherwise, the rest of you are going to go through our regular indoctrination program here at Nha Trang, and then we'll send you out to your various A camps. So I decided that seemed like a good idea to volunteer again. I figured, what the heck? Because I was already a volunteer for the Army, a volunteer for Airborne, and a volunteer for Special Forces. So I might as well just make it a complete triumvirate. And so I volunteered and ended up at what was then known as Command and Control Detachment South, B-50, which was Bambi Tuot. It was an organization, part of an organization called MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group.
So as this whole thing kicks off, is there a moment for you where you ever look at it and go, maybe this wasn't such a great idea? Maybe I overestimated my volunteering and put myself in a position I didn't want to be in.
Well, that probably happened when I got to Ban Me Tuot, which was the base camp for CCS. And they sent me to the what they call the 1-0 school, the Recon Team Leader School at Long Ton, which was down near Saigon, because I'd never heard a shot fired in anger.
Really?
Had no idea. And I reported down to Long Ton with some other guys, and one of the operations we did at Long Ton after some of the classroom work, and we went out on local operations. Excuse me. We actually heard shots being fired, and it was a small firefight off in the distance. We weren't involved in it at all, but it kind of struck me like, okay, now this is the real deal. This is no more John Wayne movie. This is no more Hollywood. This is the real deal, because we're out in the middle of the jungle, dark as can be, with a 6-man team and practicing what we're supposed to go back and do for a living. And people are starting to shoot, not at us at that point, but people are starting to shoot around us. And it was, yeah, I guess I'm really into it at this point.
Now, for civilians listening, Special Forces has changed certainly a lot over the years, but one of the key components of it that hasn't changed is the idea that as a Green Beret, you implant yourself with indigenous population and you sort of work with them hand in hand to do some covert stuff, but also what we call foreign internal defense to help train them, use them as allies in the fight against the enemy.
Exactly.
Is part of that what you are doing when you guys get on ground there?
When I got back to Bambi-Tuit after I'd gone through that Recon Team Leaders course, I was assigned to a company there at Bambi-Tuit, and we began working with Montagnards, who are the mountain people of Vietnam. There were Chinese Nungs, who were Chinese mercenaries, and there were Cambodians. There was a whole Cambodian company. And you're absolutely right. We started working with them, and I learned so much from them, because it readily was apparent to me that, yes, I had the benefit of all this wonderful training that the U.S. Army had put me through as a Green Beret, but that took a year to do, and I was still learning. I knew I was in the learning mode, whereas the people that I was working with, particularly in my case, I had a Montagnard team. They'd been doing this for their whole lives. They had been living Vietnam their whole lives, combat and all. And so I knew that I could learn from them, and hopefully I had some expertise in certain areas that I could pass on to them. And that's where it became readily apparent that working with indigenous peoples, I had been told that the whole time while I was going through training, but now it was very apparent that that's exactly what we were doing, and that's what I was there for, and that's what I was supposed to do.
This first experience in Vietnam lasts how long for you? Because for those, I don't want to skip too far ahead, but you go back again a second time. So how long are you there the first time?
Tours in Vietnam were 1 year long.
Okay, even for the Special Forces at this point in time?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, there's a lot of ground to cover there, but if you describe the first deployment, are you someone who, you say you didn't hear a shot fired in anger, but that doesn't mean what you weren't doing wasn't dangerous. It doesn't mean that, the risk is any less. I mean, was it all you thought you had signed up for in retrospect?
I think the people that I was with made the difference. And I say that throughout my entire career. I've been to some great places. I've been to some not so great places. But everywhere I've been, I have learned from someone. And that's why, and I don't want to get into this right now, but that's why I think it's so important that each of us needs to be a mentor to someone else, because we all have experience and expertise that it's incumbent upon us to pass on to others. And so I learned a lot from guys. I sat down with guys in that camp and talked to them, guys that had been in Korea, guys that had been in World War II, guys that had been in special operations and involved in missions all around the world, things that people never heard of. And yet they were willing to share with me and to prepare me. And that was one of the great things I think about Special Forces. A lot of the regular Army units didn't have the time to do it, but the Special Forces community had the time, and they felt it was important to them to pass on to the next generation what they had learned. It's kind of like a tribal philosophy. Mm-hmm. Special Forces is a tribe, and the oral history of the tribe is passed on to others. And so that's where I started really learning about things. And And up to that point in those early days in Vietnam, hadn't heard a shot fired in anger, but I heard a lot after that.
Did you guys lose anybody on that first go round?
Not on the training missions, but I lost guys on my teams later on.
Okay.
And the teams I'm talking about now are 2 Americans and 4 mountain yards, a 6-man team for the most part, and then at times operating almost as a small platoon size element for missions of body recovery and things like that of team members.
Does that change your perspective on what you're doing after you lose people?
I think it makes it more important on me to be careful and make sure that I have given the right guidance, that I have prepared my people in the best possible way that I could, and that I support the people that work for me in what they need at the moment. And so it changes your perspective a bit, because it's hard to lose someone. It's hard to lose someone you've worked with and lived with, because part of the whole thing in Special Forces is, we work with indigenous forces, but we also live with them. We're with them day in and day out. We're in the same barracks, we're in the same hooches, wherever it might be, and we're in the same field operating environment, wherever that might be. And you become very close to those people. You become closer probably to people in a combat situation than in any other situation I can think of in life.
Yeah, it's and that's that's a completely different combat experience. And you gain an appreciation. I think that is tough to get other places. I mean, combat is different for everybody, obviously, and everybody's sensory perception towards it and how they react towards it is different. But that sort of, it's one thing to put your life in the hands of a fellow American and ask them to save it because you're on the same side. It's a completely different thing to put your life in the hands of somebody, a Vietnamese person, or in my case, an Iraqi who ultimately did save my life at one point. That is a level of trust that it's hard to sort of, describe, because you're putting a lot of faith in people that you have no reason to put faith in other than, hey, we're in this together.
Yeah. Oh, I agree completely. And the mountain yards that I worked with, they saved me. So I give full credit to them.
Yeah. See, I mean, I'm only here because Iraqi soldiers I trained, prevented an ambush from happening on the vehicle that I was in. So, I on one hand, I'm like, I trained them, so I'm glad it worked out. But on the other hand, they didn't have to react the way they did. And I'm only sitting here, by the grace of God, but also from that sort of kinship, that sort of brotherhood, for lack of a better term, that you develop by living with somebody every single day and training next to them every single day, day in and day out, even if they're not wearing the same flag on their uniform.
Yeah, my mountain yards, when we got shot out of a particular target that we had gone into recon, and they were moving ahead of me towards the helicopters in the landing zone so we could exfil, and I was providing covering fire when I got shot. And they came back and got me, which wasn't a requirement of them other than we were a team. And they got me to the airplane, got us out, and we all came out luckily on that one.
So you survived the first tour. When you have to go back, are you thinking, hey, this is just what I signed up for? Or is it like, I don't know if I'm going to survive round 2 of this sort of deal?
I went back, and when I first got back from my first tour in Vietnam, I think I thoroughly alienated everyone that I had known before.
How so?
Friends. Well, it was a very frustrating period in America. I got off the airplane. Again, we landed at Seattle, Tacoma, and they put us on buses and took us over to Fort Lewis and gave us new clothes, new uniforms. And there were protesters outside the wire. There were people that spit on us or tried to.
Yeah.
It was a really turbulent time in America, and I get that. But I think through the mentorship that I had up to that point, I was lucky enough to understand that what I was doing or had been doing for the last year in Vietnam was exactly so those people could be there and protest if they chose to. That was their inalienable right. I didn't like it, and had it been a pure face-to-face confrontation, I probably would have gotten a little physical with somebody because I didn't like people doing things. But I went back to Fort Bragg, and I had to relook at myself. And I was lucky there because, again, I ran into a couple of senior non-commissioned officers who set me down. They had been through the same thing. And so they set me down and talked to me through that process and explained to me the anger that I was feeling, because when you're taken from a purely war situation and then just immediately dumped back into civilian life in America, it's quite a shock. It's almost as big a shock as going. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't real good at handling that. I could shoot really good and I could do all kinds of other stuff, but I wasn't used to handling that emotional response. And so these guys set me down, talked to me, and they didn't know what to do with me. So they were starting up a new Recon Course out at Camp McCall, which is a training area just off of Fort Bragg that Special Forces uses. And so they sent me out there as an instructor for the basic Special Forces basic field training and the Recon Course. So I was an instructor in both. I taught land navigation and patrolling and then recon techniques to people. And as I was doing that, I looked around and I felt like I was doing something pretty important. I was helping train some people, and yet I felt like I wasn't being used to my fullest potential, because I really felt good about the tour that I had completed in Vietnam. And there was still a lot of stuff going on over there. There was a lot of activity. And so I decided that I needed to go back. It was the right thing to do for me. It was the right thing to do for Special Forces, and it was the right thing to do for the country. I'd left some very good friends back there, the Montagnards and some of the Americans. I think the other thing that struck me of the 36 people that I went through that final training phase with before going to Vietnam, at the end of the first year, there were 16 of us left. And I just felt this in need to go back and not, I wasn't looking for revenge, but I was looking for some kind of connectivity and closure. And so I volunteered to go back for the second tour and did. At the end of that tour, there were 8 of us of the 36 left.
Do you think there, in retrospect, was any survivor's guilt about the 16 that had not come back after that first tour?
Yeah, I think probably there was a little bit of that also. And I felt a little guilty about, okay, I'm back here. There's still some of them left over there. And then there was a whole bunch that didn't make it. And so there was probably some survivor's guilt involved in that too.
Yeah, I don't think people can, well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, there's survivor guilt comes in many different forms, right? I mean, it happens
Sure.
when you lose a family member and things of that nature. But when it happens, see, the thing is, when it happens in combat, the only way you sort of, quell that feeling is to put yourself back in the line of fire again, right? Because it's the only place you feel like you belong.
Exactly.
Where you can actually, and again, revenge is not the right word, but it's sort of like, at least I can take the fight back to the guys who took my buddies away, right? Like
Exactly.
I can do so. I can take some sort of impact. It's not like, and anybody listening out there, forgive me if you went through this experience, but if you get into a car accident with friends and you're the only one who survives, it's not like you driving a car again all of a sudden, makes it better. But you back in the fight where you lost those people, it sort of just quiets the soul, if that makes any sense.
It does. I know exactly what you're saying, and I agree completely.
So when you go back the second time, are you in the same area? I mean, is Vietnam dramatically different? Because not many people went back for a second tour. I mean, most people did their one and got the hell out of Dodge.
It was pretty much the same because I went back to the same organization. The mission had changed slightly, but not a lot. And so we were still doing the same thing. We were doing cross-border operations into Cambodia, Laos, and North Vietnam on small recon teams to try to identify and locate movement of organizations, supplies, equipment, stuff like that coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail or some of the peripheral trails that brought weaponry and people into South Vietnam as combatants for the North Vietnamese.
This sort of experience different from a combat standpoint? I know you said you didn't hear a shot in anger. Was there more violence this time around than the first?
Oh, there was. It was. We were kind of on the lower end of the scale because they had started drawing back some of the U.S. forces, and the Army of Vietnam, the ARVNs, had started taking over some of those responsibilities that kind of covered us before. There again in both tours there were plenty of shots at me, around me, and through me in a couple of instances, but it was a bit different this time. There was a little less support than we had before, but again, the mission started to change a little bit too, from deep into some of those denied areas and make the shorter versions, if you will. But we also found that we were not being able to stay in. We were getting shot out of our target areas a lot quicker, it seemed like.
I hate to ask such a general question, but given what you were doing, is there a time where you're like, I'm much deeper behind enemy lines than I ever should be? Like, this is bad. Like, do you get this feeling of overwhelming, like, holy shit, this is going a lot worse than I thought it was going to be type deal? Or, does that not ever really enter into your mind as when you're going out and doing this stuff?
Well, it did one time in particular when I was inserted into Cambodia, and we normally expected to be inserted by helicopter and then exfilled by helicopter. But we also had E&E plans, escape and evasion plans, that if the helicopters couldn't get to us, then we would have to find our own way out, if you will. We'd have to walk out. And there was one time that I was put into Cambodia in such a location that it was closer for me to go to Thailand than it was to come back to Vietnam. And that really kind of felt far out there. Luckily, I didn't have to use it and walk out that way. But it kind of puts you on the edge just a little bit.
How much more loss do you deal with in the second tour?
Probably about the same as before. Unfortunately, the command and control detachments, and there was one at Da Nang, there was one at Kontum, Pleiku area, and then there was one at Ban Me Tuot, had very high casualty rates, both dead and wounded. And that seemed to hold pretty much throughout the entire existence of the MACV-SOG organization.
I want to fast forward for a quick second because you're actually back in Vietnam for the fall of Saigon, correct?
I was in Vietnam. I came out of Vietnam and went to the 1st Special Forces Group, which was on Okinawa. And the 1st Special Forces Group sent a lot of teams into Vietnam to support the 5th Special Forces Group that was actually in Vietnam. And there was a point in time when Saigon actually fell that I was on a team that was detailed to another government agency to go back into Saigon just prior to the fall and extract some high value assets. And so we did that and then came out, and that was a little crazy because that one was a little antsy. There was questionable support So nobody knew who they could depend upon at that point.
Yeah. To say the least questionable.
And so it's like, geez, all right, yeah, we'll do this. But, and there wasn't, to be honest, there wasn't much of an E&E plan for that one because you're kind of stuck in a very vulnerable position.
Yeah. I mean, 3 trips there and back. Do you ever wonder how you got out alive?
Oh yeah. Yeah. That comes up in my mind every once in a while. Because I mean, I came out and there were times when I'd come out of the field and there'd be holes in my uniform that I didn't even know about. Luckily, they didn't hit me, but and I'd have holes in my equipment, my rucksacks and stuff. Knowing that we'd been in a big firefight, just extracting ourselves, and then how did I get through that? There has to be. In every soldier, I think, a certain amount of spirituality and faith, and that kind of that bolstered my faith, I think.
I do want to jump forward a bit, but I want to get back chronologically because you had the fortunate pleasure. I don't know if pleasure is the right word. You had the fortunate opportunity to go back to Vietnam many years later, which.
Yeah.
From people who have done it and returned to the site of, important battles or important moments in their personal combat history, there is a huge amount of catharsis for it. There's a part of me that would jump at the opportunity to walk through Baghdad again and just relive some of the things that are, burned in my mind for the rest of my life to see if I could ever put them to bed. What was that experience like for you? How emotional was it? What did you get out of it?
It was pretty amazing. It happened in 2017, about 45-ish, 40-some years later, because I had talked to guys throughout my Army career later on that had been in Vietnam, and then they went back. There was a couple of different guys I talked to that I remember that said, man, that was something to go back. It really... It did something. It was a very positive thing to do for them. And I was like, okay, sure. I wasn't sure if that was the beer or whiskey talking or really them. Mm-hmm. And so in 2017, I got involved with a company called GORUCK, and I think you talked to Jason from GORUCK. And when I got involved with them, I went to one of their events, and I said, he was asking me, he said, well, what do you think about this? And I said, that's pretty interesting. I'm amazed that people pay to do this, but okay. I said, and you build some great rucksacks, you build some great apparel, some gear, pants and stuff. But I said, what about boots? I mean, the most important thing for rucksacking, if you're going to put a rucksack on your back, you better have a good pair of boots on your feet. And he said, well, interestingly enough, he said, we're just in the process of doing that. How would you like to be involved? I was like, okay. And they had looked all over America to try to find somebody to build boots, but everybody that was building boots here was totally full. They didn't have any room for excess production. And so they came up with a company in Saigon that would build the boots. They build shoes, I think, for Adidas and Reebok. So they said, yeah, we'll build the boots. And so Jason contacted me in mid 2017 and said, look, how would you like to go back to Vietnam? And it kind of stopped me. And I said, well, let me think about it. Well, I thought about it a while, and I thought, but in for a penny, in for a pound. I mean, I've volunteered for it before. Why not volunteer for it now? At least nobody will be shooting at me. And so I went back, and it was a very interesting trip for me. I was lucky that I was with three other guys, none of whom had been in Vietnam during that period of time, but they were very supportive. And it closed a circle. The best way I can explain it is it closed a circle that I didn't know was open. That I went back and we visited Saigon, and I had been to Saigon several times for debriefings. We went to the top of the Caravel Hotel at the Saigon bar, and that I had been to before, and drank a few beers. And we actually made a trip by automobile up to Ban Me To It from Saigon, which is where my camp was, and visited that, and then dropped across to Dalat, which I had been to a couple of times before, and then back to Saigon. So I got to see some of that area that I had been in when I was in Vietnam, and it was a good thing. I mean, some of the smells, the sights, the sounds were exactly as I remembered. And then, of course, the country has gone so far beyond as a country. Their entrepreneurship is amazing. And to see what they had done with their country, regardless of what kind of regime was in charge, was terrific, because they've always been this entrepreneurial society that is great in business, and they're kind of the crossroads of Southeast Asia. If you look at it from the how stuff, equipment, and clothing and foods and everything else travels around all over that part of the world, they're at the hub. And so to see all that going on, and to go back and to visit that place and see the places I had been was pretty amazing.
Did you know when you were there at the moment that you were closing the loop, or did you have to get back to sort of digest it and decompress from it?
I think it came after I came back. The full knowledge came. It felt good to go to some of these places and to see the people. I mean, the factory that the boots are made in just outside of Saigon is near Long Ton, where I went through team leader school and heard those first shots fired in the distance, and came to the realization that I was in war. So that the factory was there. And then just moving around, seeing all the people, feeling the pulse of the country, and where it had gone on. And an interesting thing happened to me. We got there about 10 o'clock at night, and we started drinking Tiger beer, which is a Singaporean beer, but it's all over Vietnam. And we never went to bed that first night. Got up we were up the next morning when the roosters crowed, and we decided to go downtown Saigon to the War Museum. The American War Museum is what they call it. And it's their take, because the victor always gets to write the history. Mm-hmm. So it was their take on what had happened during the Vietnam War. So it was interesting to see. There was a lot of equipment there. There was some panoramas and displays and so on. And it was getting kind of warm. So I went out into this one little area, quiet, shaded area, and I sat down on a bench for a minute. And this fella came up to me, and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "Are you American?" And I said, "Yes." And he introduced himself. All I remember is he called himself BD, and then I don't remember the rest of his name. But he said, "I'm from Singapore." He said, "Do you mind if I ask, were you here during the Vietnam War?" And I said, "Yes, I was." And he said, stuck out his hand, and he said, "I would like to thank you." This is a guy from Singapore. And I said, "Well, okay, thank you." But I said, "What for?" And he said, "No matter what happened here," he said, "it's my belief that you stopped communism from encroaching throughout the rest of Southeast Asia." And that kind of, I think that started the whole trip, the positive aspect of the trip for me. Here's somebody unsolicited, had no idea who the hell I was, to come up and say that to me. It made me feel pretty good.
Yeah, unbelievable. You had wrote in an op-ed piece, and I'm quoting you here, "Unpacking war takes time, and sometimes we simply aren't interested in doing so. For the current generation of veterans, especially those who spent extensive time in Afghanistan and Iraq, the wars they fought are not yet a closed chapter in world history. It's too early for them to know what their legacies are and what their battlefields will become when the U.S. leaves the stage. But they're already grappling with these same questions while also trying to forget the experiences that scarred them and otherwise affected them." As far as your legacy in Vietnam, what do you think it is, and have you answered all those questions for yourself?
Well, it's interesting you point that out. The thing that I had to learn, and I learned it from my mentors, was if I just sit around and do nothing but but think about the war effort that I went through and that those around me went through, I'd probably be in pretty bad shape. What I learned to do was I built this giant oaken box in my head with metal straps on it. And I take those traumatic events that I have been involved in, and I'll put them in that box. And then in my own good time, when I feel it's appropriate, I will take them out, I dust them off, and I look at them. And I observe them from various angles as best I can. I always have a bias, of course, to a certain degree. We all do. But I look at those events, think through them, and then put them away. And ultimately, I am proud of the things that I have done, as every veteran should be. But I understand, too, that none of us are infallible. None of us are without fault. I have probably made mistakes. Others have made mistakes. America's made mistakes. But all we can do as an individual in a particular moment in time is the best we can for those around us and for those that we're responsible for. And that helps me make it through.
Yeah, I mean, I almost would jump at the opportunity to go back to Baghdad and just walk around and be in some of the places. I know I would probably be shaking while doing so. I mean, the thought of doing it again sort of even kind of nerves me a little bit. But I can only imagine the peace that you get from that, at least knowing walking back over that turf gives you some semblance of purpose and almost relief that maybe it wasn't all for naught.
Exactly. And I think that was one of the things I took away from this trip to Vietnam. And that was what we as Americans saw as total chaos in Vietnam when we withdrew and the South Vietnamese government fell and the North Vietnamese took over, was regardless of looking at it as a negative event, there was positive things that occurred afterwards, not because of it, but positive things had occurred for the people. And any place, as I said earlier, any place I go, any place I've been, the important thing is the people there. And the Vietnamese people, the Montagnards that I dealt with individually, they're some great people, and they're very open, and they're very businesslike, and they make things happen. They don't sit around and feel sorry for themselves. And if I had any part whatsoever in leading to that, regardless of the negative or positive aspects of what I did, then I feel better about it. And going back and looking at what they've done with their country just made me feel good. Because I was able to look at both Saigon, and then on a second trip we made about a year later, we went to North Vietnam. We went to Hanoi, and then we did some boot testing further north in a town called Sapa, right on the Chinese border. And it's just an incredible. I give kudos to Jason for allowing me to go back there and participate in that, because it was so great to see.
Yeah, I think you've encapsulated it perfectly. I don't want to try to find a better way to put a bow on that, so I'll leave that there. And I'd like to get back to sort of your story, because again, a lot of people do the Vietnam thing and then they call it a career, but certainly that wasn't the way it was for you as you go forward. Now, where you end up next, at least from a major standpoint, obviously you did some things in between for Vietnam, but some schooling and whatnot, but Operation Eagle Claw. Now, we've told this story before on the Hazard Ground from people who were involved with it. And for those who don't know, Eagle Claw was the attempt to rescue the Iran hostages that were stuck in Iran in late 1979 into 1980. And this is the operation that sort of spawned the idea of joint special operations, because it was the first time that they had tried to get different, parts of the military together.
Right.
And I'll phrase it this way. The plan was grand, right? Again, essentially we're sending in, aircrafts to try and sneak in, steal the hostages out from underneath Iran's nose, and then get them the heck out of Dodge back to the United States. The plan was grand, and it was one of those things that ended sort of badly on the surface, but I think the lessons learned about it are underscored because we only see the end result, right? For those who don't know, one of the airplanes crashed in the middle of the desert. They never got there. They aborted the rest of the mission, and it was kind of an embarrassment at the time that it was a failed attempt to rescue the hostages. So, and obviously, there's a lot of this that is it's not still classified, but the way it's spoken of is in very veiled terms. So with that in mind,
it's sensitive.
Yeah,
it's sensitive in nature.
Right. With that in mind, I mean, as much as you can, you're sort of rolling this whole thing and kind of give me the lessons learned from your standpoint.
Well, let me step back one little bit. When I was on Okinawa, they closed out the first group on Okinawa, deactivated it in 1974, and brought everybody home. And so they took all of us that had been in the first group, and they passed us around to the other special forces groups. And through the luck of the draw, I had been through the scuba school on Okinawa. They sent me to Key West, Florida, to be an instructor in the Army Scuba School, which was really tough duty, but somebody had to do it. And so I was down there, and a friend of mine was the sergeant major, if you will, of the Special Forces School at Fort Bragg. And I'd been down there probably about a year, and I got a call from him that said, "Hey, you need to come up here and you need to talk to the commandant of the school. He has some questions for you." So I found a C-130 that was going through the area and hopped a ride with them, flew back to Pope Air Force Base at Bragg, and reported in to my friend and the colonel. And the colonel was a guy named Charlie Beckwith. And Beckwith talked to me for a while. I was a staff sergeant at that time. And at that point, if you will, I had met him before. I'd met him in Vietnam, not as a great mentor, but just kind of in a couple of passing times, because he ran an organization called Delta in Vietnam. Project Delta, which was Project B-52, which was an in-country reconnaissance, and I was in cross-border reconnaissance. But I had met him. I had talked to him a little bit. I had not gone on any operations with him, but he knew who I was, and he knew my friend who knew me very well, probably my closest friend in the Army. And so Beckwith at that point in time recruited me with the caveat that I'm going to send you to a couple of schools, and then I want you to come back. We're going to start a new unit. And he didn't say what it was all about. And that was the beginning, not just me, but others. But that was the beginning of the formation of First SFODD, or what most people know as Delta Force. Mm-hmm. And that was the organization that conducted Eagle Claw. It was, as you said, an interesting operation. It was a very complex operation. And it brought together organizations or units from all the services, the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. It brought everybody together. Now, at that point in time, there was not a lot of joint operations. The units within, or the organizations within the military, didn't operate a lot together. Now, we worked a lot with the Air Force. We didn't work a lot with the Navy, and we didn't work a lot with the Marines. So now you've got separate services that are trying to come together to form a joint task force that's going to conduct this extremely complex operation. And that got really tough. And it, as you said, one of the things that it did, and it pointed out, and I remember one of the guys that I knew from that was a guy named Pete Schumacher, General Peter Schumacher, who I met as a captain and knew him then. He and another general officer later on named Jerry Boykin, both of them were young captains, super guys, some of the most intelligent guys I've ever met. That operation was laced with, again, the complexity. It was laced with fault points, and it pointed out, and I think Schumacher probably said it best. He kept a picture of the crashed aircraft that you mentioned on his wall when he was Chief of Staff of the Army, to remind himself that we must always look forward to doing things better. I'm paraphrasing his words here. that from that failed scenario, the helicopter crashing into the C-130 and the loss of the 5 Air Force guys at that point in time, we must always strive to be better than we are. And so that, what it helped point out, while it was a failed mission and we all felt totally depressed and just totally down about that mission not being successful, it brought forth a brand new way of looking at special operations forces within all the services, and ultimately led to the creation of Special Operations Command down at Tampa, Florida, who controls they're responsible for all of special operations, Navy, Army, Air Force, and Marines. And that's, so something good comes out of something bad.
Yeah, and that obviously is, what we use it for today is unimaginable at the time, right? I mean, if we had the foresight to know how vital that was back then, obviously we may have different results. At any point in time during the planning, does anybody feel like there's just too many moving parts here for this all to go well? We're hoping for a lot of things to go right, so to speak. Is there a sense in any of that?
I think there was, amongst all the planners and the people that were going to participate. Everybody at some point or another felt that there were just so many disparate parts that didn't necessarily fit as well together as one would hope, that everybody was kind of hanging their ass out. Mm-hmm. and yet at the same time, there was a binding feeling of, we have got to make this work because there are hostages being held in a foreign country against their will, and we've been given the charter to go get them, and we've got to make this happen, and it's got to happen right. So I think there was some trepidity with a lot of people. People just were like, I don't know that this is going to work, but let's give it a try, and then tried to smooth out those problem areas as best they could, understanding that there, with so many moving parts, if one thing goes wrong,
the rest of the dominoes fall, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
From things that went wrong to things that went right in your career, Operation Urgent Fury, the invasion of Grenada, in October of 1983. It's hard to find an operation that goes this smoothly, all things considered. But you look at it, and in retrospect, this is the sort of apex of the time of what special operations and some of the tip of the spear guys really do, right? This is the sort of operations that you guys really are built for.
Mm-hmm. And it was interesting that at that point, a lot of changes had been made in equipment and procedures, radios. Separate organizations could talk to each other now, whereas during in the period around Eagle Claw, the Air Force was operating on one set of radios, the Army on another, and so some jury-rigged stuff had to occur, and people really came together to make that happen. But now at Urgent Fury, a couple of things. It was much closer, first of all, to the United States, so it was easier to support directly.
Right.
And you didn't have to use intermediates and intermediaries to conduct your operation. And a lot more training had occurred between organizations so that it was much smoother as an operation ran, that it ran the way it was supposed to. And people were used to working together. They knew each other's idiosyncrasies and their different way of doing things. And so they were able to quickly make allowances for that and make it a successful operation.
The next question I want to ask you about, because one of the most interesting things I think in your bio, one, because I'm a huge fan of the movie, but Charlie Wilson's War and the sort of covert war that we fought against the Russians in Afghanistan. What can you tell me about your kind of role in that and sort of how that all unfolds? Because you talk about history being written by the victors. We don't often talk about that victory from an American standpoint.
That's true. And that's kind of unfortunate, but it was highly classified at the time, or at least that's my understanding of it. So that I think that came into play a bit. And I've got a really interesting piece that'll go on the back of this too. I was back in the 5th Group at that time, and we were deployed to Pakistan to get the missiles, the Stinger missiles, which were shoulder-fired missiles against aircraft, to help the Mujahideen fight the Soviets. And so we were in Pakistan trying to figure out how to get over the Hindu Kush, which is one heck of a set of mountains, and get this stuff up to the Mujahideen that needed it to fight their war or to continue their war. And so we're all sitting there, and the Stinger missile comes in a box that's probably, 2 feet by 18 inches by 5 or 6 feet long. It's a great big sturdy box. And we're looking at these boxes. There's quite a few of them there, trying to figure out how are we going to get these over that mountain. And one of the guys from the team came walking in, or one of the teams came walking in and said, "Well, that's easy. Let's use those donkeys over there." Like, what? And we stepped outside and looked, and right next to where we were, it's kind of a warehouse thing, was this corral full of donkeys. And we're like, oh, okay. And so we made a deal with the owner of the donkeys, and I cut a deal with him to use his donkeys. But then that also meant we had to haul donkey food. So we're each of us is rucking a little bit of donkey food over the mountains while these little donkeys are, and I've never seen anything like it. These little donkeys just take little mincing steps up the mountain, and I'm walking behind this donkey, and I'm thinking, man, this is kicking my ass. And I don't know what it's doing to you, donkey, but I'm having trouble with this. And he's just steady moving along, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to let a Pakistani donkey beat me up this mountain. So I stayed right with him. So we got up to where we had to meet the Mujahideen, and we met them, and we turned the missiles over, gave them some training on it and stuff, and then got back out. Interestingly enough, jump forward, that was in 85-ish. Jump forward to 90, maybe 2000. I had gotten out of the Army in 94, and I had gone to work for Fayetteville Technical Community College at Fort Bragg, and I was the vice president of military programs. And I got a call from the university where I got my master's degree, which is just up the road from Fayetteville. And one of their deans said, you have a contract on Fort Bragg to teach non-commissioned officers various skills, from radio frequency to emergency lifesaver to all of some really basic skills. And I said, yeah. And he said, would you participate in a panel up here at Campbell University with a group from Afghanistan who are looking at how they can develop a program to create non-commissioned officers, because their non-commissioned officer system was virtually non-existent. And I said, well, yeah, I'd be happy to. So at the appointed date and appointed time, with the blessing of my president, I went up there. It was just a day trip for me. And of course, I'm the low man on the totem pole. There's all these academics sitting around this table, and at the head table is an Afghan general and his aide, and then a couple of other people are with him, his small staff that he brought with him from Afghanistan. And as people, they started on the other side of the room from me, and people went around and they explained who they were, what their job was at the university, how they thought maybe they could help. And so it got around to me, and I was like, I'm not really an academic per se, so how am I going to introduce myself? So I stood up and I said, allow me to say that it was my pleasure as a non-commissioned officer in the 5th Special Forces Group at the time to support the Mujahideen by taking missiles to their fighters, something to that effect, words to that effect. And this general jumped up, the Afghan general jumped up, ran around the table and threw his arms around me. And I didn't realize it because I didn't recognize him. He was one of the lieutenants that we delivered the missiles to.
Get out of here. That is unreal. It's funny.
It was amazing. He's embracing me, and they're all looking at him like the two of us are crazy.
When you were telling that story about you being back in Vietnam and the guy approached you and asked you if you were here in Vietnam, that's the way I thought the story was going to end. Like, he recognized you. He was in Vietnam and he recognized you. And because I've actually heard people tell that story before, like, when they've gone back, they've bumped into somebody who lived in the village that they were in right. while they were fighting. I thought that's where the story was going. Now it actually does come full circle that a lieutenant you handed a Stinger missile off to knows you, 30 years later.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was absolutely
incredible. Just out of curiosity, did you see Charlie Wilson's War? Have you seen the movie?
Yeah, I have.
Did you think it was fairly described accurately as you remember it?
I think there was probably some artistic license taken,
right.
But I think it followed pretty much what occurred with Larry Vickers and all that, and then I remember when I watched it, there was some actual footage of some donkeys with stingers on it.
Yeah.
And it's like, whoa, hey, how about that?
That's crazy. At this point, between Vietnam and what you did there, and then you go on to Eagle Claw, and it's Grenada, and now it's this. I mean, do you still have the passion and love for what you're doing at this point? I mean, like, you've put your life on the line so many times. Does it just seem routine at this point for you?
Well, what became most important to me, and I don't know the exact time that it occurred. It was somewhere in here, right? Probably right about this time, that it became more important to me to begin mentoring the young guys on my teams and educating and professionally developing those soldiers, making sure that they went to the right courses, that they went to the right things, that they did all the things that they were supposed to do to make them safe, not just make them for the Army, but to make them safe in the future conduct of their operation. And I felt it was so important for me to pass on, because I had learned that from all the old guys that I had been through. It really started coming out to me at this point how important all of those guys had been to me. And now I wanted to be that important to these other guys. It didn't so much matter if I was right on the front line kicking ass and doing all that kind of stuff. It was important to educate, and not in a formal sense, but in a mentor state. That's what began driving me at that point.
You go to Panama in Just Cause, the Manuel Noriega sort of snatch and grab, if you will, sort of deal, and you're part of the first Gulf War as well. Anything of note? Because I do want to get to Mogadishu, but I was just curious if there's anything about those parts of your career that stand out.
It was. I give credit to all of those that were there, that participated, that highly professional organizations that were just stellar in the way that they did business. There were not any. There's always accidents and things that occur, but they did everything with aplomb. That they conducted themselves as soldiers should, in the sense that they were mission focused and making sure that they did their job on that particular piece of ground. And that goes for both Panama and Gulf War, all of that stuff.
So let's fast forward again to Mogadishu. Now, what's interesting, and we have told this story at least a dozen times from multiple different people, whether it's Colonel Lee Van Arsdale, Mike Durant, Matt Eversman, Jeff Struker. I mean, that's just some of the people that we've interviewed on the podcast. You guys can go back and listen to all those episodes because they're great. And it's amazing. For as much as that I've studied Gothic Serpent from a military standpoint and just talking to people, and every time I ask somebody who's been there something about it, I learn something new, right? Like I learn a point of view about the battle that I didn't know. That said, when you were part of this operation, and I want to know exactly what your role is in it, but it's one of those things where you're one of the few people who has legitimate combat experience in Somalia, because a lot of the folks who were there, you look at the lull in time. I mean, obviously Vietnam was the last major conflict, but if you weren't a guy who was fortunate enough, because Just Cause wasn't a mass operation, there was only a handful of people there, respectively speaking to the rest of the Army and the rest of the military. Same thing with Urgent Fury, and that was 10 years prior. So from that standpoint, the Gulf War lasted all of, 35 seconds in the grand scheme of things. So a lot of people didn't get a chance to be part of that either. You've got legitimate combat experience under your belt heading into this thing. And so from that standpoint, obviously you talk about always downloading that information, right? Mentoring the other guys. Like going into this thing, do you get a sense is there any sense, do you think, that it ends up turning out to what it could be? Or like, do you feel like it could ever have possibly turned out the way it did as you first start the whole thing?
Well, I certainly didn't. And certainly the people you mentioned that have been on the podcast before, that's a stellar crew of people. I mean, that's some serious stars there. That's serious business. I had the chance, back in, I guess it was in the early 80s, to help establish an additional special mission unit. And that's who I was with during Gothic Serpent. And so I was working with some younger guys and observing to a great degree what the key guys that you mentioned were doing. And I was offset from them, and we were conducting basically intelligence operations at that time, and had no idea that what appeared to be a relatively standard event would turn into such a terrible show and such a terrible event for so many people, with so much heroism that went on in that.
It's interesting that you use the word terrible, because I don't hear many people who we've talked to about it use that word in the context that we generally think of it in. I mean, you, in fairness, you did mention the heroism, but a lot of the people there who fought in that battle, yes, the loss is terrible, but the loss is terrible in any battle. I guess clarify for me when you say terrible, what about it was terrible? Was it just the loss you're referring to, the loss of the 19 people?
Yeah, primarily to lose that many people from such a high level group, if you will. It was a terrible thing to happen in the sense that we lost those guys at that point in time. And I'd been to Mogadishu before, earlier in my career, back in, I think, 85-ish. I wasn't impressed with the place then. And I certainly wasn't this time. And
there's a reason nobody has beachfront property in Mogadishu.
Yeah, and the only people that have beachfront property in Mogadishu are the sharks.
Right.
Yeah. And it isn't the kind of place you think about that you want to put yourself on the chopping block.
Right.
But it's one of those flashpoints that occurs from time to time that we really don't have any control over.
Right.
That a set of circumstances occur that force us to become involved in something. And it was that backdrop and the loss of those guys, in my mind, that created such a terrific situation.
Yeah, and again, I guess I was thinking more of everybody I've talked to. They all believed in the mission, right? Like they all believed in the plan. They had very little doubts about their ability to execute it. I mean, and from that standpoint, because one of the things I always ask the people we talk to, again, I've just had the fortunate pleasure of studying this thing from every angle.
Sure.
In retrospect, do you think the plan was flawed? Did you think that anything could have gone wrong? And everybody unequivocally says no. Like nobody could have written a better plan. Garrison knew exactly what he was doing. And General Garrison is the person I'm referring to, the guy who was in charge of everything. Right, and it was as executable of a plan as you could imagine, all things considered. There was very little doubt about anybody's job or responsibility. So again, that's kind of when I heard the word terrible, my mind just went to there was such confidence about their abilities in this, and maybe that was part of the failure of it, right? Overconfidence.
I think that was the terrible that I'm referring to, because the planning, the preparation. The excellent forces that were involved, the leadership that was involved in that. You couldn't have asked for a better setup for an operation. Everybody had total faith, and I think that's why it came across as such to me, such a terrible event, because so much had gone into the preparation and the planning, and everybody knew where they were going to be, what they were going to do, how it was going to go. And then it just came apart.
One after another. When Murphy's Law took over in that sense.
Yeah.
Between Blackburn falling out of the helicopter and then everything just sort of spitballs and spirals into, ways that I don't think anybody sort of could have ever predicted. But the counter to that, obviously, as you mentioned before, is the heroism and the bravery and just the grit and toughness that those guys endured for the better part of 20 hours in a city where they were outmanned easily 10-1.
The guys that reached down inside and found what they needed to do that. Yeah, that was just my hat's off to every one of them. Always has been.
Now you said you were in an advisory role. Were you sort of watching this unfold from back at base camp, so to speak, as it was going on?
I was at a separate location, and I was observing, listening, and observing, and then we had a small piece of the action, but nothing that equated to what those guys were going through.
I only ask that because at this point, you're a grizzled veteran of this, and we've detailed it, right? You've had some very successful operations, and you've had ones that have gone not so well. I mean, Eagle Claw and but conversely, Just Cause goes easy. The Gulf War, it's like as you're observing this going on, What sort of feelings are you having as it's starting to fall apart? And is it helplessness? Like, how do you deal with that from where you are?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, because when the thing kicked off and we started listening and observing what was happening, the early stages went very, very well.
Yeah.
It went as planned, and everybody was doing their piece exactly as they needed to do it. And then when it started to frazzle, if you will, the pieces started, the fabric started to come apart. That it was a helpless a feeling that there's nothing to do. There's nothing that can be done. There's just it's kind of a black hole that you're like, where can we reach? What can we do to help? And we tried to do a couple of things, and it didn't work. And so it's like, well, it's probably going to have to play itself out, and you hope for the best, and then you start hearing about the heroic acts that people were doing, the hard things that people were doing because that was their job, and they were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, although they had not hoped to do it in this situation.
Just out of curiosity, because you're at a high level, and this is not a commentary on, at the time, Major General William Garrison, again, the guy who was in charge, but when it was all said and done, he takes full blame and full responsibility for everything that had gone on, but he also detailed out, I think it was 11 different reasons, and if you read the book Black Hawk Down, they're in the back of it. His whole letter that he wrote is in the back of it.
Yep.
Your assessment post after the fact of what he took blame for, and was he right in doing so?
Garrison he's an old style leader. He's my kind of guy. I had known him before. I'd worked for him before, and I had absolute faith in him. But he's kind of like Harry Truman. The buck stops here. He's the commander, and he's going to take the responsibility. He's going to be articulate about it, which, as you mentioned, it's in the book there, and he wrote that letter. But he's the guy. It doesn't roll downhill from him. He takes the blame. Charlie Beckwith was the same way. When Eagle Claw failed, I saw a complete change in him. That was kind of sad to see, because it wasn't his fault per se, and it wasn't Garrison's fault per se. He'd come up with the plan. He had the support there. He had everything he needed, and it's just the fortunes of war.
Yeah. You, as you mentioned earlier, decided to retire in 1994. Was it just time? Did the Army tell you they had enough of you? I mean, what was your kind of decision?
Yeah, I decided it was time. I had done just about everything I could possibly think of. I had been the senior enlisted advisor to a 2-star general at Bragg, and it was time for me to move on and let others move up. I had a very, in my mind, fulfilling career, and there was still enough time for me to get out and do something else. And so it seemed most appropriate at that time that it was time for me to go, let others come on, and let me go find something new to do. Because one of the things that I talk to people about when I go out and lecture is, a word I like to use is reinvent yourself. Reinvention. Throughout our lives, we continually reinvent ourselves. When you graduate from college, you reinvent yourself into your next persona, whatever that might be, whatever you choose to do. And there come points in our lives when we need to reinvent ourselves because of a change. And so I had reached that point when I felt it was most appropriate at that time for me to reinvent myself. I didn't know what I was going to do, to be honest. I wasn't sure. And I happened to run into an old colonel that I had worked for previously, who was working for Fayetteville Tech, the community college there in North Carolina. And he asked me what was I doing, and I said, well, I'm just kind of hanging out. I was scraping the bottom of my sailboat at that time. I had a little bitty sailboat. And he said, you need to come work for me as a college recruiter. And I said, me and the word recruiter don't go very well together. He said, no. All I want you to do is go around and visit your friends, your sergeant major friends on Fort Bragg, and drink a cup of coffee and tell them about these courses we're running that don't cost soldiers or units anything. The Army's paying for it. They just have to give the soldier up for a week or two for this particular training, and we'll give them a better trained soldier back. Well, it kind of made sense to me. So I started doing that, and then I started pursuing my own education, and then kind of worked myself up through the chain from recruiter to a program coordinator to a director, and finally to the vice president of the college for military programs. And so it was a reinvention of myself. Again, I didn't know what it was when I started it, but I knew I had to do something different. And I didn't want to be that guy that sat at the club and drank beer and told everybody all my old war stories. Right. Although I'm kind of doing that now.
Minus the beer.
Yeah. Well, I think there's probably a beer here in the fridge, and if you and I ever meet, I'll buy you one.
Hopefully more than one at this rate, right?
Yeah. But it just seemed like a good time for me. I had been able to help form 2 brand new units in the Army that had never existed before. I was in on the ground floor of doing that. I had been in units with some of the finest soldiers that I have ever met in my life. And there's good soldiers in every organization. But for me, these were some of the finest guys because they stood shoulder to shoulder with me when the times got bad. And it was just time for me to move on. Decided that and chose to get into higher education, such as it was, administration.
You mentioned earlier your connection with GORUCK. How did you ultimately end up with those guys?
Well, I've been asked by a couple of different organizations to make presentations on leadership and management. And one of those organizations was Team Red, White, and Blue, asked me to come to Atlanta in 2015, I guess it was. And so I went and gave a presentation to their regional captains, the folks that run their organization throughout the region. And from that, Team RWB and GORUCK knew each other. And so they set up a Rucking University in Jacksonville Beach, Florida at GORUCK's headquarters, and asked me to come and give a presentation there in late 2016. And that was the first time that I'd ever heard of GORUCK. And I came down to Jacksonville Beach, met Jason McCarthy, who is the CEO and founder of GORUCK, and gave the presentation. And then I participated in one of their events, and he and I kind of hit it off. We had some things along the same way because he's an ex-Special Forces guy. Mm-hmm. He was an 18 Echo, a commo guy, and I was also at 1.2. So we had some commonalities. And so that's when he invited me to the event in February of 2017 at Bragg. I was still living in the Bragg area. And I went out there, and that's when we had the discussion about boots and all that stuff. And I watched one of their big events, what they call a heavy event. And he said, I'd like to get you more involved with GORUCK. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, I don't know. He said, but, we kind of hit it off. And he said, if we get you involved in these boots, maybe we'll call you an ambassador or something. I said, yeah, sure, whatever. And so that we continued it from there. And then that's when he invited me to go to Vietnam. And then he called my bluff a couple of years later and said, look, you've been working with us. You've been writing things. We did the videos and a bunch of other stuff. He said, you need to reinvent yourself and move to Jacksonville Beach and go to work for GORUCK. I want you to come down as the senior advisor. And so I said, all right. And sold off the houses I had in North Carolina and moved to Jacksonville Beach and became senior advisor to GORUCK.
Great company. Again, we spoke with Jason McCarthy, founder of it, in a previous episode. And, you know, there is so many kind of themes that GORUCK represents that are so important to veterans and their lifestyle, and that connectivity that we all sort of lust after, even, you know, the days we take off our uniform. You know.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I think they do very, very well is create bridges between the military or veteran community and the civilian community. And I think that's important for both sides to understand. As veterans, we need to understand we're part of a civilian society. And civilians need to understand that we're there, we've been there to support them, and now we want to integrate ourselves back into that society. And it's an important thing for both sides to understand and work together, hopefully to build better Americans. Because my idea is that you build a better American, they'll go back and build a better community. Mm-hmm. A better community will build a better nation. And so it starts at the grassroots level. That kind of comes from special forces and working with by through and with others to support a particular activity or operation. Well, our operation here is to make our communities, our individuals stronger, and to make our nation stronger.
You're 70 plus years young at this point, and you're working for a company that is continuing to move and shake and get out there. I mean,
there's some great young people that work for GORUCK, and there's some great young people that are involved in GORUCK events all over America. And if I'm energized by their energy, and if I can pass off some of my knowledge and experience to them and it helps them, then it's a synergistic thing that makes both of us feel good, and I certainly feel good about it.
Well, I was going to ask you if there's any sign of you slowing down anytime soon.
Not if I can help it. I have to keep involved in something. I'm not one of those people that can just sit and do nothing. I'd really like to be involved, and I particularly like to be involved with young people because that's a great area to mentor others in.
You mentioned mentorship so much throughout our discussion so far. Outside of the obvious, why is mentorship so important to you? I mean, you know, I get your as you talked about, you know, you're going to give lessons, you're going to create better people who create a better community and all those things. But mentorship, you know, at its core, you have to find people who are willing to be mentored, right? Like, it's not as easy. You can talk till you're blue in the face, but there's not always an audience that's willing to listen.
Well, that's, I think, why I like so much the people that attend GORUCK events, the people that are involved in GORUCK. You're absolutely correct that it's hard if you find somebody that won't listen to you. Sometimes you got to understand that that's just the way it is, and you've got to walk away. But the key is to find those people that are hungering for that information, whatever it might be. And there's plenty of them out there. There's people in every community. And you don't have to be somebody with a whole lot of experience. You can be relatively inexperienced, but if you have some knowledge about something, everyone should go out and find someone to mentor. I don't care how old you are or how young you are. You should find somebody to mentor and help them and encourage them to become mentors either then or later on in life. And you're not always successful. It's just not going to happen. But it's amazing how many people do want to learn.
What's more of
and for those that do, it's great. Say,
what's more of a challenge, being mentored or being the mentor?
I think it's pretty equal, to be honest, because if you're the mentor, then you have to understand that you're not, you never talk down to anyone as a mentor. You talk to them. That's where a lot of people make a big mistake. You're not up there giving a lecture in a big lecture hall at the university with 250 people in the class and hopes you get through to 2 or 3 of them. That isn't what mentorship is all about. Mentorship is on the base level, and those who are being mentored need to understand that it's not just criticism of them or critical in the way that they've been doing things. It's simply a way to pass on knowledge of what works and what doesn't work for that mentor's life, and perhaps some of that. And you got to be smart enough to figure out what it is as the person being mentored, that you need to take those kernels that work for you and use them, and take the rest of it as chaff and throw it away.
I mean, it's hard to encapsulate, nearly 30 years of service and everything that you went through. I mean, we've talked about so much, but core themes beyond mentorship that stay with you today from your service.
Leadership. Leadership is so critical at all levels, in all organizations. And there's a lot of people that think they know leadership. And I'm not saying you have to have been in combat to know leadership, but there's 100 books out there, or way more than that. The 7 things you should do as a leader, the 15 things you should do as a leader, the 21 things you should do as a leader. A leader has to live leadership. Moral, ethical, correct leadership. And I think more and more people should strive for that than actually do. There's a lot of people that think they're leaders, and they're really not. I have known, I think, some of the finest leaders in the world that I have ever met. Some of them were Army officers, and some of them were indigenous forces. They're great leaders. There's leaders at every level. And every leader needs to continually strive to be a better leader. That's the overarching of everything that I take away from my military time. To lead men in combat is a very worthwhile, heartening, and saddening thing to do.
Powerful words, and wholeheartedly concur. As somebody who still wears a uniform, leadership at its core is, we just don't have enough of it, and it resonates when you say some people think they're leaders and they aren't.
Exactly.
Leaders' ranks don't matter. Leaders' positions don't matter. People are drawn to leaders regardless of what they do and what position they hold. I am continually inspired by, the lower ranking individuals than me that I see that show leadership traits. And to your point, those are the people that I lust to be around and want to make better, right? I want to give them more opportunities. I want to give them more challenges. I want to see them succeed, and continually throw more their way. And I've said this repeatedly on the podcast, throughout my time in the Special Forces community. The only way I knew I was doing a good job is they kept giving me more work, right? And that was the measure of success. And when you see people like that around you in your organization, just keep feeding them more work and watch them succeed over and over and over again. And really, that's when you find out who your leaders are.
Absolutely. And that points out something that I have always said, and I don't know that I'm not necessarily the author of it, but the most important thing that any leader can do is develop their subordinates. That's the key job of any leader. And that's exactly what you're talking about, is find those subordinates that want it and make sure that you develop them to take your place. And you shouldn't be threatened by it. You won't be threatened by it if you're a good leader. You will embrace it and enjoy it, and support those that are willing to take that extra step and to take those extra jobs and those extra counseling sessions in the right manner to make them a better leader.
Perfectly said. On that note, I do want to thank you for everything that you've shared with us, and it's been a ton. I think that your experience and your knowledge and just the sort of mentorship you've given our audience over the course of the last 90 plus minutes has been something that I think a lot of people are certainly going to treasure and value. So I certainly appreciate all your your honesty and being willing to talk about a lot of things that, one, sort of conjure up a lot of old feelings and emotions that you don't always deal with every day. But two, again, there's some stuff here that not a lot of people are familiar with. So I am grateful for your time and certainly your willingness to share it all with us.
Well, I thank you for having me here, and it's been my pleasure.
Richard Rice, thank you for being part of the Hazard Ground.
Thank you, Mark.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.